In today's video tutorial, we are making a really fun and simple Halloween cake, which will have a witch theme. So I'm starting out with a tall 6-inch double barrel cake, and I have frosted it with vanilla buttercream. And as you can see, I've already gone over it so that the frosting is fairly smooth. I did that with my bench scraper to smooth it out as best as I could, but now I'm going to go back in and kind of texture it. So if you don't have it completely smooth, it's okay, but I like to go over it with a bench scraper just to make sure that we have an even amount of frosting all the way around. So I have my offset spatula. I have the cake glued to the turntable with a little bit of frosting. The cake is on its own cardboard cake circle as usual. And just starting with the bottom, I'm lightly pressing down into the frosting. And you can see with each rotation, I'm just bringing it slightly higher. And I'm just gonna scrape off when there gets to be a lot of excess frosting on my spatula. But you can do whatever frosting technique you like as long as it's not really super bumpy, because we do have some fondant pieces that we're going to be putting on, and so you don't want it to have too much texture, just something fairly shallow if you're making an impression. Okay, so we'll carry this all the way up. I love this technique because it's very forgiving. Textured buttercream always has a really unique look to it, and it's very simple to create. If you wanted to create a similar look on top, you could just start in the middle of your cake and spiral outward. Okay, so now I'm going to chill the cake in the freezer for about 15 or 20 minutes so that the buttercream will become nice and firm and I can easily move it to my pedestal, and then we'll begin decorating. I'm starting off by using a template to cut out our witch shoe, and I'm just using some black fondant that I have kneaded a little bit of Tylose powder into, and that's optional, but it helps it to firm up a little bit more quickly. And I've rolled the fondant to about 1/8 of an inch thickness, and I just use an X-Acto knife, or you can just use a sharp knife to do your cutting. So once we do the first one, of course I'll just make a second one also. And I like to let mine firm up a little bit, even though they are going to be supported and backed by the cake. So I have a cookie sheet here that has been lightly greased and then dusted with some powdered sugar. And I'm just going to let that set up for several hours. Okay, so next I am cutting out the witch legs. You can see that I've rolled my fondant very, very thin. I've tinted it with Americolor Electric Green. And I'm using a template just to make sure that both legs are the same size and width. But if you feel comfortable freehanding it, you could just freehand it also. Okay, and then once the legs are at least dry to the touch when you touch the surface, you can go in and do your designs, whether you use food writer pens, or in my case, I'm painting on a design. I am using coloring gel, black coloring gel mixed with a touch of vodka, and I just have a small flat brush that I'm using to create the stripes. You can see the first time that you do the stripes, they might be see-through. And that's just because the green is so bright and the color is diluted by the vodka. But it dries so quickly that you can just go back in with a second coating, and that's all that it took to create the solid black lines. And I think that gives us a really cute look for our witch's legs. Okay, and then this is an optional step, but I love polka dots, and so I'm just using my round piping tip to create 2 sizes of dots. We're going to use the smaller dots for the boots a little bit later, and then the larger dots will be on the cake. So I'm just doing several different colors. And you can use a piping tip 10 or 12. My small dots were created with a piping tip 10. But if you want slightly larger dots, you can go with the 12. And then our boots, witches boots, are going to have bows on them. So for that, I'm just using the template just to make sure that our bow loops are all going to be the same size. Since we're doing 2 loops, we're going to need, since we're doing 2 bows, we're going to need 4 loops. But there's lots of different decorations that you could use for the boots if you would rather go with a flower or some other design, buckles. Okay. So once you're ready to create your loops, I like to gather mine on one end and give it a pinch. And then we just kind of lightly fold it. And I'm just cutting away the excess so that you won't be able to see that back piece from the front. Okay, it's a good idea to have little shreds of paper towel or pillow stuffing that you can use as a filler, just so that the fondant won't lose its shape as it dries. And so it will take a little bit of time for these loops to dry. Again, I like to use a little bit of Tylose powder kneaded into my fondant because it really does help for it to dry faster and to hold its shape better. Okay, so there's our second loop. And you just want to make sure that they look like they belong together. They're about the same size. And then I like to go back in and just lightly trim away the very tip of each side so that they fit together a little bit better. And now I'm just doing the second set of loops. And finally, the tails for the bows are just little thin strips of fondant, and you can just cut that little notch out of the bottom and then just pinch it on the other side into a point. And see that all just fits together nicely. And the last step is going to be to create the knot for the bows, and we're going to do that a little bit later. Okay, so we're ready to put the bow on. I am using a little ball of my fondant that has a tiny bit of water kneaded into it. You can see how sticky and tacky that looks, but it makes a really great glue, especially for these kind of chunky loops. So I'm just going to press those right into that sticky glue. By the way, my loops have been drying probably at least for, I would say, an hour. So they're holding their shape without having that little paper towel filler inside. Just kind of play around with it until you're happy with the positioning of the loops and the tails. The fondant is still slightly soft, but it's dry enough to hold its shape. Okay, and finally for that knot, I'm starting out with a ball of fondant. I'm just going to press it right on. You could leave it just as a ball. I think that looks cute too, but you could also go in with a toothpick or a scribing needle and create an impression that just makes it look a little bit more realistic. I'm just cleaning everything up, and of course do the same thing for the second bow. And that's it. For our polka dots, I mentioned earlier, we have these little green polka dots. These were created using a piping tip tin. And I'm just attaching them with a little bit of piping gel. And now that the boots have firmed up a little, I'm just going to glue them to the cake with a little bit of buttercream. And the legs have firmed up some too. So I am just sliding those behind, just a little bit is behind the top of the boot. If the legs are just too long and there's a lot of overlap, you might even want to trim them down slightly. And as a final detail, and this is optional, but I think it's really cute, I'm using a large petal tip to create a ruffled skirt for our witch. And I'm just using an up and down motion. The opening of the piping tip has a teardrop shape, so just make sure that the small end of that piping tip or a small end of that opening is down, and that way you'll have a nice thin edge to your ruffles. And you can see that with each row, I'm just slightly overlapping the row before. Okay, so our cake is finished. I love how it turned out. I think it's such a cute and fun cake for Halloween, and as you saw, it's not a difficult cake to create, so I hope you'll give it a try. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.